Welcome to TrineDay's Roundtable 30, Founding Father Robert Morris and Money in America, Economic Justice and the Narrative Creation Process. I am Bruce the Taurus, moderating. These roundtables explore President Kennedy's 1963 peace plan and Henry George's 19th century economics, which make life affordable and prosperity possible when they are used. We will hear from Chris Milligan, publisher and host, Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould, who will discuss the narrative creation process, and special guest Robert M. Morris, who will discuss the indispensable contributions to America's founding made by his ancestor, Robert Morris. His book, Robert Morris, is available at TrineDay.com and the usual sellers. Then we'll have an open discussion and Q&A with everyone. We hope to explore the following questions. What is money? On what should its value be based? How can a democratic republic best pursue economic justice and opportunity for all? And now, our host, Chris Milligan.
Bruce, thank you very much. And everybody, thank you very much for spending your time with us. I know you could be doing something else, but we live in very interesting times. And
you're not lulled by the momentary.
One thing that I'm going to talk about here a little bit is education, because we should have all known about Robert Morris. Okay, we should have all known about the plot that Smedley Butler stopped in the 30s. Okay, but one of the first, I talk a lot about the secret societal system.
Our ship of hope.
One of the first things that
here astern
that
still welcome
Skull and Bones did, which was one of the main secret societies here, was to take over our education system. They basically we had an organic education system that had been started by preachers and by industrialists to teach their workers that had been brought over from England, and then the Skull and Bones people brought over the Prussian education system because the Prussians were very upset when Napoleon beat them. And so they actually started compulsory education where they took the children by bayonet point and took them to school to teach them what to think instead of how to think. Okay. And so I want to read something here that Senator John Kennedy did in 1957 as he was speaking to a Teachers Association convention in Baltimore, Maryland. And here it goes. All of you are familiar with the motto credited to Francis Bacon, but actually traceable back to ancient scriptures that reads, "Knowledge is power." No doubt that slogan has appeared on many school or teacher colleges' bulletin board. I would emphasize the importance in teaching students about public affairs, of avoiding the confusion of political idealism with political fantasy or rigidity. We need idealism in our public life. We need young men and women who will stand for the right regardless of their personal ambitions or welfare. But let us not permit them to carry that idealism to the point of fantasy, to the point where any compromise or concession is regarded as immoral. For politics and legislation are not matters for inflexible principles or unattainable ideals. Politics, as John Morley has acutely observed, is a field where action is one long second best, and where the choice constantly lies between two blunders. And legislation under the democratic way of life and the federal system of government requires compromise between the desires of each individual and group and those around them. Henry Clay, who should have known, said compromise was the cement that held the Union together. Henry Clay said, all legislation is founded upon the principle of mutual concession. Let him who elevates himself above humanity, above its weaknesses, its infirmities, its wants, its necessities, say if he pleases, I never will compromise. But let no one who is not above the frailties of our common nature disdain compromise. Knowledge is power, said Francis Bacon. It is also the light. In the dark and despairing days ahead, our youth shall need all of this light that the teaching profession can bring to bear upon the future. In his book, One Man America, Alistair Cook tells the story which illustrates my point. On the 19th of May, 1780, as he describes it, in Hartford, Connecticut, the skies at noon turned from blue to gray, and by mid-afternoon had blackened over so densely that in the religious age, men fell on their knees and begged a final blessing before the end came. The Connecticut House of Representatives was in session, and as some men fell down in the darkened chamber and others clamored for immediate adjournment, the Speaker of the House, one Colonel Davenport, came to his feet, and he silenced the din with these words: "The day of judgment is either approaching or it is not. If it is not, there is no cause for adjournment. If it is, I choose to be found doing my duty. I wish, therefore, that candles may be brought." And that was John F. Kennedy as a senator in 1957. And onwards to a much better future.
Chris, you never stop bringing stuff we could do whole roundtables about. So much meat in there. Thank you very, very much for that. Let's remember that at the end when we do discussion and question and answer. And now, my friends, Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould, indefatigable investigative journalists and authors with typically mind-blowing insights and information. Hello.
Hello and welcome all. Paul and I want you to get a little bit of a sense of how we connected to the narrative creation process. So this is a little bit of a very quick summary of how we ended up right here now with the amazing story that we're going to be talking about after I make this presentation. The missing history in the mainstream narrative from the creation of the USA to JFK and what we can do about it. We left journalism to write screenplays in 1987 when we realized that we could not change the fantasy mainstream narrative on the US role in the 1979 Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And then in 2007, this process extended into the ultimate myth-making machine, Hollywood, fulfilling its purpose by choosing the propaganda story of Charlie Wilson's war to become the final word on the US role, and that most Americans still believe is real. In 2020, we found a new level of this reinventing of history when we faced a challenge from an Oxford-published academic attempting to establish a far more corrupted narrative on Afghanistan than even Hollywood manufactured. Given our 40 years of research, it was easy to debunk the narrative academic thesis. But as we had discovered back in 1987, our efforts to debunk that thesis were ineffective in stopping the narrative that were given to people through the mainstream media. But given our 40 years of research, it was debunked. But as we look back, we saw that the ability to change the mainstream narrative was totally mesmerizing the American people. It's been reinventing that reality to suit their purposes for millennia. But since the mainstream process can only deliver fantasy stories, there is hope once you question their narrative. And as we have continued to entwine our personal story with the 1,000-year history of the Fitzgerald family through writing, we have witnessed the true power of the personal narrative creation process we all possess. Its ultimate purpose was revealed to us in the words of the prophet Daniel that I will now share with you. Shortly after his conquest of Jerusalem, King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream that eluded him, and when he awoke, but left him feeling prolonged anxiety. The Jewish prophet Daniel, who described his God as the revealer of secrets, was able to interpret the dream. Daniel reminded the king that his dream had been about a bright and shining image composed of various metals. Daniel said that the gold head of the image symbolized the Babylonian Empire. The silver crest, the brass hips, and iron legs and feet of iron mixed with clay represented the worldly kingdoms of the world that would succeed Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, Byzantium, and the West. In the dream, the image was destroyed by a stone not made by human hands, but out of the mountain, which smashed the feet and crumbled the image, and the pieces blew away like dust in the wind. Daniel said that this stone that brought down the last world kingdoms, crushing history, would absorb all the kingdoms of the earth into itself and become the stone kingdom that would last forever and never be destroyed. And I think that is what we are really coming here to talk about. And I think that that is exactly what I think Robert Morris and Rob Morris, as the deliverer of his message, is here to bring you. Another one of those missing stories that once we hear them, we can then begin to change the narrative and make it our own.
Thank you, Liz. Rob Morris, the floor is yours.
Well, hello, and thank you very much. I'm not sure I'm worthy of that introduction by the Fitzgeralds, but what I would like to do is to get right into my presentation about Robert Morris and his role in creating the American financial system. The first thing to realize about the early American economy, it was based on the colonial extractive model. That meant that goods and commodities were extracted from North America, sent to England under strict trade policies. And in return, value-added goods were sent back on trading ships. This resulted in Southern planters being in perpetual debt to merchants in England because they were underpaid for their, say, tobacco and overcharged for the pots and pans and billiard tables that they received in return. The trade was conducted using financial instruments called bills of exchange. These were like personal checks, and colonial merchants had accounts in English banks to back them up. There were no American banks at all. However, it often took up to 18 months to clear the books on one shipment, and with these bills of exchange were then used as a private currency in subsequent trades in the course of arranging shipments shipped back and forth across the ocean. This was all fine until the 13 colonies broke away from the British Empire. You can see British banks did not do business with the Americans during the war. This combined with the fact that the supposedly rich people in America were in debt to England left the country without any money. So they printed their own and tried a number of tricks to back it up, starting with land banks, which, unlike modern versions, acted like a kind of a mortgage to the state and ended up with pure fiat currency based on the promise to pay once tax money came in. But that money was also fiat, so what did you get anyway? This was bad enough within a state, but when people traded across state lines with a variety of state currencies, things got even more uncertain. This resulted in people using foreign currencies instead. Popular among them was the Spanish milled dollar, a silver round of a certain defined weight that could be divided into 8 pieces. 2 bits was a quarter. A whole round was called a piece of 8. With this in mind, it's easy to see why the colonies started off pledging goods to support the war effort. They had plenty of them and very little money. And very little else of value. What was difficult to make work because the enemy was running an embargo off the coast. So moving bulk commodities around to service the needs of a mobile army required ox carts over dirt roads and barns. This, plus the fact that farmers accounted for the goods that went to the war effort at 100% over the price they charged their friends in the local markets, goes to explain why soldiers suffered so in the encampments. As the local currencies degraded in value, interest on loans taken from American citizens went unpaid, and the state requisition system wobbled under its own weight. The Congress managed to go bankrupt and started to write bad checks in Europe, ruining their creditworthiness. At this point, the Congress turned to Robert Morris. He had recently started a private bank in Pennsylvania to help the war effort, and they asked him to reproduce that success on a continental basis. He had been operating a secret trade agency in France that established a faithful relationship with the French crown, So what Morris did was put a shipment of French silver he acquired as part of the French loan into the Bank of North America, thus providing some local liquidity for commerce and loans for the bank from the bank to the continental government. He also overhauled the supply system. Instead of moving tons of goods around on ox carts, he hired agents to buy supplies in markets near the soldiers. Thus, he moved from a barter system to a system based on money. To operate this new system, he needed the states to send their promised support in the form of money instead of bulk commodities. The agricultural states didn't want to do things this way because they didn't have the money and liked the idea of sending overvalued goods instead. Morris envisioned a national financial system with the states supporting Congress, who would in turn support the states with purchases. So Morris wanted to demonstrate how the system worked by using his own money in the form of notes to get the ball rolling. He sent out his notes to pay contractors who then used them to buy local supplies for the troops. The people who received these Morris notes then used them to pay the taxes to the local states. These states then turned them over to the Congress to satisfy their commitments. When the notes came back to Morris, he retired them. Sometimes people would just take the notes right to the bank and cash them in, and Morris would lose money. Oh well. The French king was very gracious in his support, and much of the war effort was paid for by selling pieces of these loans through brokers like Chaim Solomon to prosperous Americans who bought, say, for example, a $100 bill of exchange written on a French account in Paris for $90. The buyer would take that bill of exchange to Paris and get the full $100 and make $10 for his profit. In the meantime, Morris would use the $90 to buy supplies for the war effort. The southern states mostly didn't want Morris to be in control of all the money and refused to send any to him, so funding suffered, and when Morris failed to get a tariff passed as an alternative form of funding, it became obvious to the King of France, and he decided if Americans weren't going to pay for their own war, he wasn't going to pay for it either. This resulted in John Adams being dispatched to Holland to see if he could get some Dutch speculators to buy American debt and bail out the Congress. They did at the very last moment, just before peace was signed, and the soldiers went home practically empty-handed. Before Morris left office, he submitted his plan, Report on Public Credit, to Congress, and it rested on several pillars. These included a head tax on slaves, and a tax on real estate, and a tax on import. This was not popular with slaveholders who had thousands of acres of unproductive land, so it didn't pass under the Articles of Confederation. After the war, there were several kinds of debts to consider: loans made by citizens to the states, loans made by citizens to the Continental Congress, debts owed by the states for unpaid requisition promised to the Congress, debts owed by Congress to the French, and debts owed by Congress to the Dutch. The states tried to pay their debts to their citizens by laying on taxes to fund the payments. This led to debt holders trying to pay a tax to repay themselves, which was unsatisfactory, as you can see. Also, they imposed tariffs on goods coming from other states, and this harmed the economy of all the states involved. Congress had already tried to repay loan office certificate holders with other loan office certificates, which only magnified the debt. The states bridled at the idea they should pay more to Congress now the war was over, and they were pleased when Congress was run out of Philadelphia. Congress tried to repay the French debt with tobacco shipments, but the tobacco market crashed, leading to an increase in internal taxation in France, and finally the French Revolution. Dutch speculators were ultimately repaid and participated in a land deal in New York called the Holland Land Company deal. Economic chaos that was left by these debt issues contributed to the creation of the Constitution in 1789. When Washington was organizing his cabinet, he asked Morris to be the Treasury Secretary, but Morris declined and suggested a young lawyer named Hamilton instead. Morris became a senator. Ultimately, Hamilton's solution was that the federal government would assume the debts owed by the states. Also, the loan office certificates in the hands of citizens were assumed, and both groups would be paid by a tariff. Ultimately, debts by states to their citizen creditors were also assumed. How did he pay for this? He issued his first report on public credit, and it looked like Morris's. However, his plan sidestepped the direct taxation issue of Morris's plan, so it would not run into the same opposition, and instead he relied on tariffs almost exclusively. However, Hamilton's plan to settle these federalized debts with tariff collected at the ports went a long way to making the whole thing look invisible to average citizens. Hamilton's use of the first bank of the United States was modeled on Morris's use of the Bank of North America. Hamilton's mint was based on Morris's mint proposal. Hamilton's currency was based on Morris's decimal currency proposed a decade earlier. Morris supported these policies while in the Senate, reporting for 40 committees, and suggested on worked on legislation to implement those policies, which he had so much trouble getting into action from his previous role as superintendent of finance. When Congress finally adopted the American dollar, Americans had already been using the Spanish mill dollar. Why? Because Morris brought thousands of them in from Cuba during the war to provide a reliable medium of exchange in domestic commerce. He did this by selling ships full of commodities to the Spanish in Cuba for the silver. The French coins also circulated, and they were basically used as a depository in the Bank of North America as the basis for that bank's loans to the Continental Congress. The American way was begun, which meant using American debt only to fund capital infrastructure improvements like canals and lighthouses. These improvements would in turn move American commodities to American markets where they'd be consumed or used in value-added activities like making clothes from cotton or iron from ore. The owners of factories would seek other opportunities in innovative companies, and innovators would own their own ideas and profit from them. All these transactions would enrich the population, provide employment, which led to the formation of private capital, even among the working classes who then became middle class. The idea of a private bank that issued currency was based on the idea of keeping control of the currency out of the political world, thus attempting to avoid the well-known dangers of fiat currency that devalued according to political whims of officials. It was thought that a private bank was not subject to political forces because private individuals would be responsible and moral hazards would be criminalized. This worked pretty well for over a century with little inflation. Also, during the first 60 years or so of American history, the reciprocal non-political trade arrangements Morris set up in his first trade deal with France was made during the Revolutionary War and kept Americans out of foreign entanglements and allowed the economy to get a firm footing. Manufacturing was also part of Hamilton's plan, and it was well underway until the slave power took over and did their best to discourage trade with a self-imposed embargo that mostly impoverished the anti-slavery North. The slave power fought the banks to keep the North weak, so the South's peculiar institution would not be disturbed. This came to a bloody head in the Civil War, which ended with an explosion of industrialization and wealth creation, which was then throttled back again in the 20th century with the Federal Reserve, and then controlled through the process of the regulatory state and prosecuting 2 world wars. Now, unfortunately, the states and the federal taxes consume about 50% of the income of citizens, and it's still not enough for their ambitions as they run up unsustainable debts to finance their policies. And if history is any guide, this will not end well for them. That's it.
Yeah.
That was really
That's
wonderful,
That
Robert.
was always fun.
And, you know, he didn't include everything. I mean, his grandparent, whatever, basically financed the revolution, okay, and made it all happen, and then set up Mr. Hamilton. So,
Well, Morris had become such a lightning rod that he knew that if he took the role of Treasury, everybody would be attacking him the way they had when he was superintendent of finance. So he put Hamilton in the role and then quietly, as a senator, implemented everything through the legislation.
Wow. Wow.
I mean, serving on 40 committees is kind of a heavy load for a guy.
Oh, my goodness.
Can you talk about, Rob, toward the end, what the South was doing that seemed to abuse or strangle, you know, the interests of the North that led to the Civil War in the framework of the forces of national independence and prosperity versus those still serving the empire of Britain?
Well, I think the people in the South were used to being in control. If you're a slaveholder, power is your life. And you don't want anything to upset that. So you had all these upstarts called mushroom people derogatively because they popped up overnight with instant riches. And they didn't want to be disturbed by these people and their annoying ability to make money and make things and basically push them around with their wealth because they had thousands of acres and hundreds of slaves, and they saw themselves really as the power that should be in America. So when they used the slave vote, which is essentially a trick of the electoral college to count slaves for the electoral representation, they had the ability to represent themselves mightily, outsizing themselves as far as the count in the electoral college. So the election of 1800 became the flipping point where the South became the power, and they held on to it, really. And they just didn't want anything to bother their economic system because they didn't want to change it. They were farmers, and they're conservative in that way, as in not interested in change.
And can you speak to the Browns in Rhode Island and what they did?
Well, the Browns in Rhode Island were basically a shipping family. I'm not an expert on them, but I will point out that in my book, I discovered that the reason Morris couldn't get the tariff through during the period of the Revolutionary War was because the Browns did not want to pay a tariff, and they were shippers. And they basically used the power that they had, the economic power, to run newspaper articles and trounce the idea of sending any money to Washington, or actually Philadelphia, to the Congress. And they blew all this smoke around, and people were scared about it. But what they were really doing was betting against the loan office certificates, and they would buy them, trash them in the press and buy them up, and then make it look like it was going to pass, and then they sold them when they were high. So they were just manipulating the market. And eventually they decided that they didn't want it at all, and it failed. And as soon as that failed, then the people in Virginia said, well, okay, we're not into it either. And then it all fell apart. They tried that twice, and the people in Rhode Island blew it up both times.
And they were slavers too. The Browns were.
Oh yeah, they were big slave merchants, and there are other people in Rhode Island other than the Browns who were quite involved in that, all the way down to South America.
This issue of slavery is really intriguing because I never really put that factor into the founding fathers' differences, that actually was affecting very significant events that went way beyond the actual Constitution and the Bill of Rights into the whole arena of an economy that is equitable for everyone, and to better understand, I mean, especially what happened to Robert Morris, where he was kind of written out of history. Okay, and I was really wondering if you had any opinion or deeper history on this delineation between slave mentality and people who are beyond slave mentality as being some defining line that we may still be suffering from in many ways.
Well, I think I mean, if you look at the difference between Morris's attitude towards the economic future of America, where he told his son, you have every chance to be as successful as I am, but you have to work at it, compared to the people in Virginia who believed in primogeniture, where the first son just got everything. So it was a huge cultural difference. And then you had the act of being a slaveholder is an act of power, where you have to control other people all the time and exert your control over them. Where in the North, your economic system and your outlook was more reciprocal, where you said, well, I'll do something for you if you do something for me. And so it's a huge difference. And the power-hungry people just got the power. It's basically as simple as that. And then they held on to it, and they still behave that way, unfortunately.
Yeah, I just wanted to make the point, though. I think what they switched from was literally slavery to wage slavery. I think that was the mentality that actually moved with the slave mentality.
Well, I will point out that the Federal Reserve was designed and put into law by the same political party that was the party of slavery. You know, so it's a power move.
Yeah.
It wasn't meant to, you know, liberate people and set them free so they could take advantage of their own lives.
Yeah.
It was to cement their power and make it impossible for people to disrupt it.
What's the difference between Morris's bank and Hamilton's early bank and the Federal Reserve? Is there a difference?
Well, yes, there's a big difference in that the first banks were hard money banks, meaning that they had silver or gold in their chests, and they could only risk as much paper as they were responsible for risking. Whereas the Federal Reserve is a bank that is based on generating debt and shifting the debt onto the people of America. I mean, that's basically their model. You know, just face it, your dollar bill is not worth anything except it's a debt certificate that other people have to pay you when they pay taxes. Whereas in Morris's case, he said, we need to have a currency that is accepted worldwide. And how do you do that? But you use a worldwide standard commodity like silver, where an ounce of silver in America with something stamped on it is worth as much in America as it's worth in Portugal with the different stamping. I mean, you know, so it was, you know, money is a commodity, is something used to transfer value. You don't want your money to lose value before you buy something else. The Federal Reserve, their goal is to decrease the value of the currency by 2% every year. 50 years, you got 100%.
Rob, a lot of historians like Anton Chaikin show a close collaboration between the Southern plantationers and the British Empire to suppress the kind of robust wealth of a very strong United States. How much British influence did you see in the Southern effort to keep things the way they had them?
Well, the curious thing about this is there's a fellow now, Henry Lawrence, who had been in business with the Royal Africa Society, which was basically the Crown's slave trading group. And he became the president of Congress. And when he went on a fool's errand to Holland, he got captured by the British, and they set him up in the Tower of London. I mean, you know, they imprisoned him. He didn't have a bad time. He got a very nice portrait painted. And when it was about time to finish up the negotiations in Paris, they let him out. And he went down to Paris and he hooked up with his pal, who was on the other side of the table representing England. And together they decided that people in America would pay England for all the slaves that were let go, or England would pay America for the slaves. England would pay America for the slaves. And England didn't do that. And it created a huge fight. And the fight ended up as the War of 1812. So this guy, Henry Lawrence, was, I don't know, he was very much against Morris. He was very cautious in the things that he did. And he favored the slave power throughout his role in the Continental Congress. Eventually was so embarrassed by his overstatements, he stepped aside. Let me mention that Henry Lawrence's son-in-law wrote the first history about the United States. And in this history, he mentioned Morris once as just a member of the Pennsylvania delegation. That was it.
And when did that history come out?
Oh, I think it was, you'll ask me, in a 1787, something like that. It was, you know, they were all contemporaries. So Henry Lawrence's son-in-law wrote this history basically saying Morris was this backbencher. And that has become canon. This is what all the histories say now, even up until this McCullough did the Adams story. That's it. So he has never been able to break out of it. Because let's face it, once you're in power, you don't want to talk about the people who, you know, basically you don't want to talk about.
No,
So
indeed.
there you go. That's narrative formation in a nutshell.
Yeah, and in addition to the narrative creation, I do want to try to raise those questions about what is money and its value, and then still protect plenty of time for all audience members to participate with, questions and answers. But Paul and Liz, the narrative creation process.
Well, we got involved with the narrative creation process when we went to Afghanistan in 1981. And of course, I was working for the Christian Broadcasting Network for the 3 years preceding that. So as a result of that, I became aware of something that
Paul was the
Equal time.
Equal time. He had to interview the people for balance. There was a law at the time that if you had one side come out and push something, you had to have equal time for the opposite side. That law was Reagan ended that law. The Fairness Doctrine, that's what it was called. So the Christian Broadcasting had to have that kind of show inside, and that's what Paul was hosting.
So I was hosting a show in which I wound up having to balance some of the very conservative programming that was coming from Christian Broadcasting Network. And so that's how we wound up in Afghanistan. But the fact is that so we became very well aware of the fact that narrative creation very much relies on perception. It's what you think. The enemy will do the thing that they perceive you are doing to them. If you are tricking them, then what happened to Afghanistan was that they got tricked. The Soviets got tricked into invading and spent 10 years regretting it and admitted it. And we got involved in such a way that we got the Soviets to actually admit that they had done it. And they had done it by mistake. And they, as Roger Fisher was one of the people that we wound up involving in the Afghan issue from Harvard Law School. And he was told basically by the Soviets, they asked him if he would get involved in the negotiation because they said, we make mistakes, but we're not stupid. We made a mistake. We don't want to be there. So that was in 1982. Roger Fisher was told that. And we had gone in 1981, and our impression was clearly that the Soviets did not want to be there and were doing everything in their power to get out. And so the fact is that this was not something that the mainstream media in the United States and the Western world wanted the public to know. And the fact is that if democracy is going to work, if self-government's going to work, then you really have to have an informed electorate, and that has to participate in that. So one of the things that happened is that we went and over the years, we became involved in meeting a lot of the people who made the decisions to maintain this kind of narrative. And so one of them was Chuck Hogan, who ran the operation for 5 years for the Central Intelligence Agency. And so we brought up things. I brought up this book when we interviewed him in 2015. And he pretty much agreed with everything that we had concluded about why the Soviets went in and what had happened when we were there. And he mentioned the fact that this book was something of a problem for him. He was at Harvard at the time and a PhD, and he needed to lecture and write on things. And Michael Glennon had posed this issue. Now, Michael Glennon was the counsel for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And he also went on to teach at Tufts Fletcher School, of which Ted Elliott was the dean. Theodore Elliott had been the dean of the Fletcher Law School and Diplomacy and been the ambassador to Afghanistan from 1972 until 1978. So at any rate, I just wanted to read some things because he deals with the nature of what we are facing every day, especially this year, where we have reached a kind of crisis between the observable government and the unobserved government. And that was wasn't created in 1776 for the United States. It wasn't created until the creation of the national security state in 1947. So Glennon comments on this, and he goes into the history of it. It's a very short book. It's only about 115 pages, and the rest of it is notes. Everything is detailed. So national security and double government. So I'm just going to read the basic idea behind it, and we can discuss that at length if you would like, and we can continue with that. Let me just quote this. In his 2015 book, National Security and Double Government, Michael Glennon, professor of international law at Tufts Fletcher School, states Few who follow world events can doubt that the Obama administration's approach to multiple national security issues has been essentially the same as the Bush administration. Given Senator Obama's powerful criticism of such policies before he took office as president, the question then is this: why does national security policy remain constant even when one president is replaced by another, who as a candidate repeatedly, forcefully, and eloquently promised fundamental changes in that policy? So I present, therefore, a disquieting explanation. It borrows from the approach suggested in 1867 by Walter Bagehot to explain the evolution of the English Constitution. Power in Britain reposed initially in the monarch alone. Over the decades, however, a dual set of institutions emerged. One set comprises the monarchy and the House of Lords. These Bagehot called the dignified institutions, with a link to the past. Yet it is the second, newer set of institutions, Britain's efficient institutions, that do the real work of governing. These are the House of Commons, the Cabinet, and the Prime Minister. As it did in the early days of Britain's monarchy, power in the United States lay initially in one set of institutions, the presidency, Congress, and the courts, which Glennon refers to as Madisonian. These are America's dignified institutions. Later, however, a second institution emerged to safeguard the nation's security, which Glennon refers to as the Trumanite Network, which began with the creation of the National Security Act of 1947. This America's efficient institution consists of several hundred executive officials who sit atop the military, intelligence, diplomatic, and law enforcement departments and agencies that have as their mission the protection of America's international and internal security. America's efficient institution makes most of the key decisions concerning national security, removed from public view and from the constitutional restrictions that check America's dignified institutions. The United States has, in short, moved beyond a mere imperial presidency to a bifurcated system, a structure of double government, in which even the president now exercises little substantive control over the overall direction of U.S. national security policy. Whereas Britain's dual institutions evolved toward a concealed republic, America's have evolved in the opposite direction, toward greater centralization, less accountability, and emergent autocracy. So that was in 2015, and I think we have reached, and he predicts the fact that we are reaching a crisis point at which we will soon evolve to. And here we are. So how do we deal? He has solutions. He offers solutions at the end about more accountability and more checks and balances on the one hand. On the other hand, there's a lot of people talking about civil war, which is, of course, what happened in the first place with our double government. So we are faced constantly with this problem. How do we get this second government, which is all powerful and assuming more and more authority over the Madisonian aspects of our republic? How do we get back those kinds of powers that are inimical to what we need to do in order to govern ourselves, especially now with things such as artificial intelligence and with all the kind of surveillance society that we live in which the efficient government is becoming more and more efficient at basically crushing our ability to resist them. So, yeah.
Well, I would also suggest that the crisis, I think, that Rob just laid out with his relative and what was going on at the beginning of the creation of this country had a lot more of that. I think that power level within the, that clearly started to actually eliminate ideas that they simply didn't want, and obviously promote the people that they wanted. I mean, that when I use the word they, I mean that what we're talking about are the same types of people, is my point, that they existed obviously in the 18th century as much as they exist in the 21st century. And they seem to find each other, and they seem to be very adept at helping each other control the narrative. This is all about controlling the narrative and the narrative is really a way of saying people's perception of reality is what this is about. And perception can be manipulated in any number of ways for, quote, the good or the bad, that's the whole idea. So the fact that it was so fundamental to the origin of this country, in a way that I certainly never appreciated until we got the information about Robert Morris, and the same kind of elimination of that person's contribution and what it really meant and what that potential was that was then sidelined.
Rob, what are your thoughts about what Paul just shared?
Well, I think that what you've got basically is the outgrowth of an oligarchy that doesn't want to admit that it's an oligarchy, that is essentially controlling what people think. So what's the solution to that when they're so adept at manipulating people's emotions and kind of leaving the rationality aside? That's where we are. I mean, so you've got a bunch of people who feel good about doing things that are very destructive to themselves. So how do you stop that? I don't know. I think the best and simplest and most radical proposal is that people just stop using their cell phones.
Yeah.
They just turn them off, leave them at home, and the control goes away. It's very simple. People won't do it because they're addicted to them, which is the whole idea. But that is the simple and obvious solution to the problem.
Well, that's one step in the right direction. I mean, I recall going to buying Christmas presents about 6 or 7 years ago at LL Bean. And I had got the new credit card with the chip on it. And I said, this ought to solve some of the problems with fraud and whatnot. And the woman behind the counter looked at me and she said, they want the chip in your hand. And I said, who wants the chip in your hand? She said, the people that own this company want the chip in your hand. They want to chip all their employees.
The only way to get people have to comply with what everybody wants, what these oligarchs want. If we stop complying, it falls apart. So the best step to not comply is to stop consuming their lies, and which means put your cell phone down, just don't listen to it anymore. Use yourself, your ability to think, talk to your friends, meet with people, act like a regular human instead of an extension of a growing AI that is it's going to be more omnipresent because people are going to surrender their rational thought and just ask the computer what to do.
Well, is Mr. Dodson listening here? I'd like to hear what he has to say about what we've discussed so far.
I have some comments, but I see that Wendell Fitzgerald is asking to be recognized, and I certainly yield to him.
Regarding the monetary thing and what financed the Revolutionary War, what about the Continental that was created by the Continental Congress? I understood that was a very major part of how things were, how the war was financed. And then I understand that the Brits brought in a ship into New York and counterfeited the Continental, produced way more than the Congress did and drove the value down to zero. Not worth a Continental finally became, the Continentals were in a lot of people's hands. And then Hamilton said, we're going to redeem them at face value. Is there anything about the Continental in your book, Mr. Morris?
I didn't really focus on it because the Congress went bankrupt. And that was part of the Continental was essentially devalued 40 to 1. So essentially it became worth a nickel.
Yeah.
So it was not used after Morris stepped in because the Congress wasn't able to support it even at that level.
Yeah.
And Hamilton's interest in reviving it was basically to say, we cannot. They thought that devaluing the currency was an act of fraud because people had taken the currency in good faith that it was going to be worth something. And so if Congress had sold it to them, then they should pay for it at face value. And that was the idea. And there was speculation and everything, and people argued about it. But that was the idea.
Was there not a massive counterfeiting of the Continental by the Brits who could see that if they didn't do that, here was the Continental Congress funding the war, to at least to a major degree, I
Yeah,
thought.
they did that. Yeah, certainly. They did that out of New York, but the English were also very clever at making what they called light silver. So they would, instead of having silver at whatever, 97.6 or something, it was boiled down to, almost cheap. So when you got a light silver coin, it wasn't even worth what it was supposed to be as a metal piece.
Wow.
So they were trying to cheat everybody and drive us into bankruptcy so they could take over. I mean, they wanted us poor and they tried very hard to do that.
It seems to me that the counterfeiting of the Continental by the Brits was a clear example of creating money way more than was needed to even conduct the war, and that that drove the value of that currency down. It wasn't backed by anything; it was a fiat currency.
Right.
And if you've got a fiat currency and you keep printing more and more, its value goes to zero finally.
Right. Exactly right, which is why Morris was a hard money guy.
Yeah.
Which, so people would know what it was worth. He got into a little currency speculation. He tried to make people in Europe take American dollars. So that would create a value exchange, but they weren't interested. They said, "Oh, I don't think so. Just, we'll take gold."
Of course.
Well, Chris asked me to respond, and there's so much to respond to based on what Rob Morris has told us and what, Paul and Liz have talked about. Let me first provide a few observations about your presentation, Rob, about your ancestor. One of the things that you don't talk about is the fact that Robert Morris did for a time engage in the slave trade, and he did own slaves. He enslaved people. So he had the morality of the generation that he was living in, of the entrepreneurs of that generation. His morality was no greater or lesser than most of them. And I suspect that comes from his English background, that this is a function of the English and his learning. His learning about business and economics, I suspect, came from a study of William Petty and that generation of British economists, political economists. So, he still did wonderful things to help finance the uprising against British authority in the colonies, which he should be credited for. But if he had talked to Benjamin Franklin more, in particular, or Thomas Paine, he would have gotten a different perspective. He would have gotten the perspective of the French intellectuals, the physiocrats, of Quesnay and Turgot, and those individuals who had a much clearer, in my view, a much clearer understanding of social morality and how that affects individual behavior. And I don't think he was at all influenced by those French thinkers. So that's one thing. Another fact about the economy at the time is one of the activities engaged in, not just by Americans, but by British Canadians and French Canadians, was smuggling. Smuggling is a major economic activity in the colonial period, and it occurs all the way through the Revolutionary War. So loyalties don't often exceed individual interest in the pocketbook and taking advantage of the situation. So it was very hard to prevent smuggling because you have so many harbors. There are many stories worthy of talking about that. Now, as for the narrative that Paul and Liz, you've presented, I think my view is that our educational system has failed most people. And one reason that I say that is we do not teach our young people civic responsibilities. It should be in my view, it should be started at least at 7th grade and continue every year until an individual leaves high school. And so that every young person comes out of their formal education with a basic understanding of not only the responsibilities of citizenship, but their duties and obligations to one another in society. I think that would be a major step. Now, that leads me to probably the most radical reform idea that I've ever entertained, and that is eliminating elections. And I go back to the Greeks for an example of a at least a trial effort at doing so, of selecting legislators by lottery. What if these young people who finish their formal education with proficiency and competency in civics, if they decide when they're age eligible to enter their name in a lottery to be selected to serve in a town council or a state legislature or the U.S. Congress? The tests required would have to be different, of course, but you decide you'd like to serve in the state legislature. You take a civil service examination and you pass it. Your name goes in the lottery. And when an opening occurs in the legislature, names are selected. If you're selected, you go to that legislature and you serve for one term. It probably needs to be 4 years so that there is enough time to learn the job and perform well. And then when your term in office is over, you return to your private life as a citizen. So what does that mean? No elections, no campaigns, no fundraising, no public, no pressure from special interest lobbying groups, and perhaps, maybe just perhaps, real public service on the part of our elected representatives. So those are my radical thoughts about the narrative.
I would like to address Mr. Dotson's points about Morris's connections with slavery. Just to state the obvious, slavery existed throughout human history, 3,000 years. And it was during Morris's tenure as a representative in Pennsylvania, actually took a year off, that Pennsylvania passed the first anti-slavery law.
Right.
In 1781, Morris protected that law against pressure from the farmers. He engaged in the slave trade because the King of England made it illegal to bring in other laborers and supported the slave trade so his friends could get rich during the 7 Years' War. All of his political allies were anti-slavery, and he did not have slaves after the war happened. So yes, he was a man of his time, but the problem with slavery was there was no money. There was no way of paying people to work for you. And until Morris's plan of free enterprise system allowed people to make money and spend money, there was no way to employ people. So slavery was, of course, a self-defeating system, but it was overtaken by Morris's free enterprise system. So that's sort of an answer for you there. And then Morris was involved in smuggling. He made a lot of money selling tea against the British tea tax. And as a matter of fact, when the tea merchant came up the river, he met him and sent him packing home. So, you were right. There's a lot of smuggling and people don't always pay their taxes in the impost. But Morris had to create a modern economy to get rid of slavery, and eventually it beat the South.
Hi, my name is John, and I think it's really, really important that we respect the past and start really looking at what the economies of now and into the future are going to look like. And the polar shift scenario directly impacts how we talk about an economy that will take us through what is already happening.
If there's a polar shift and all the electromagnetic equipment fries out, we're going to be pretty much out of luck. We'll be back to the Middle Ages pretty quickly.
Yeah, right.
And so there we'll all be trying to figure out how to survive.
Do you have an impression or a knowledge of how likely such a catastrophic event might be?
It's already started. It started, I think, with the Sumatra tsunami of 2004, where 250,000 people perished. And it's going in various ways right now. And things we call tornadoes and hurricanes and other things are geomagnetic responses to this thing.
Now, if this dreadful occurrence happens, people should read my book and see how you start an economy from nothing. Well, we'll be going back to hard money.
Thank you very much. Okay. Mr. Dodson, again, going back to Greece, this lottery system, what caused them to do that in Greece?
Well, they had a hierarchy, and those who were considered to be citizens under the Republic had the right to participate at that level of governance. Now, 9 out of 10 people in ancient Greece were not citizens, and they did not have that right. Some of them were enslaved people, and others were simply not of a status. So I'm not suggesting that we adopt the Greek idea in total. It's just a germ of an idea, that the Greek experience, is a germ of an idea that with sound public education could be adapted. And we probably would have to do this at an experiment level, at the local level, a town council, a city council, that kind of thing, to see how well it would work.
Well, I think the idea of a lottery system is that you have to trust the elected officials to run the lottery. And then you don't even know who's in the lottery. So at least in our system, you have public candidates who get chosen. And then you can watch your candidate win or lose. If you're picking people out of a hat, how are you going to be familiar with 500 people? So you don't really know who won or how. And I think you have the problem of corruption writ large in that system, that you would be even more opaque than the current crazy system we have. And I think that would be the difficulty with it, people trusting it.
Well, one of the things that Glennon points out in terms of Madison stated that the key to making representative government, somebody background talking?
Yeah.
The key to making representative government in the first place was a decent education and the ability that you needed the civics training, as Ed pointed out. You need to understand what it is you're actually participating in and why it's so important that you participate. So this was essential to Madison, and apparently Madison had his doubts about whether that could be done. But the fact is that, I recall, meeting a school teacher from Swampscott, Massachusetts, at a family event at friends of ours many years ago, 30 years ago. And he said, I've been a teacher all my life. And he said, the kids that I'm getting today, for the first time that I can ever remember, he said they have no sense of what it is to be a free American. He said they almost have the attitude as if they're serfs, they're European serfs. He said they have that attitude. Well, where did that come from? How did that get into the mix? I know where I came from. I know I had very active participation with my older brothers and sisters, and in the town we had board of selectmen. There was very active stuff that was involved, very much so all the time. We were certainly involved in civic duties and the responsibility of the individuals to other people that lived near us. And if there were there was an elderly couple that lived next door to us, the town actually stepped in and they couldn't pay their taxes on their house. So the least expensive thing for them to do and the most humane thing was for simply to take over their responsibilities in the taxation. So they lived on the town and nobody felt badly about it. And then the community helped support it. And then that was New England. That was what was going on here. Now, I'm not saying that that was universal. I'm not saying that that was, that applied to all the different towns and cities and whatever, but it was a very small town attitude and a very small town. There was no stigma attached to the fact that they weren't, being all that they could be financially.
I would just mention, I do think that in the 50s, when we were basically in elementary school and going into the school system, I do think there was a lot more civics going on. I think that what began to happen is these things began to disappear. And there's all kinds of educational things that have been disappearing. And I think Ed's point is excellent, but the problem is, I think we have to think about who made the decision to disappear it in the first place. We've
Yeah,
got to find
exactly.
out what's really underlying, the underlying manipulation that we've got to be able to understand what it is, where it's coming from, and how it got so powerful, and how
Absolutely.
to deal with it.
Yeah, it's the citizen creation process, the manipulation of education. William Stranger, how are you?
How many people here are familiar with a work by William McCary Williams called The Idea of Fraternity in America? So this is a great classic of political science. And it's actually a view of the entire American political history from the point of view that this country actually had in its early years a strong sense of fraternity in local communities, obviously because of the privations that they all faced without cell phones, as it turns out, which didn't exist at that time, I've just learned. If you look at the situation in America and compare it to those times then, I would say that we have to look at the cultural circumstance of where we're at. And I would recommend that we all take a good look at the recent work of Dmitry Orlov. If you're not familiar with him, he was a Russian-born man who spent the first 12 years of his life in, I think, St. Petersburg. Family emigrated to the US, where he came through graduate school, returned to the Soviet Union, and was able to watch the meltdown of post-Soviet early Russian society. And what he noticed about them is they, of course, had some serious problems, not the least of which was the growth of criminal gangs and mafia to supply needs that the state was no longer supplying. But beyond that, they actually had amazingly an ethic of mutual support in the communities that led them to help each other out in hard times. And most people don't realize this, that most of Russia is, from our point of view here in America, almost uninhabitable, cold, very, very cold, 20 degrees, 30 degrees below zero, 6 months out of the year. They get along very, very well. And there's an idea in Russian philosophy going back to really centuries, but foregrounded in early 20th century by a philosopher named S.L. Frank, major Russian philosopher, on the social basis of society. And it's sobernos. And it's the idea that there's two ways that human beings can regard each other. We can regard each other as an assemblage of individuals, rights and duties, and joust with that. But we can also regard ourselves as a process in communion in a greater reality. And that's sobernos, the sense of we, of communion, of what in this book, The Idea of Fraternity in America, McWilliams is calling kinship. And so it's very difficult to teach people kinship who are in a society that's all about aggressive competition, individualism, and the rest of it. So the question is how, and what Orlov is in his description, by the way, of the ways in which society did the order of disintegration, first financial, then commercial, then social, and I think the fifth order is cultural. He said, America has a real problem right now. And that is that what's mostly damaged in the United States is cultural. It's a huge cultural meltdown. And you could say it's the lack of kinship. And so I would just add, that is one conversation. Then going back to the other early part of American history, I think we have to look at the fact that there are forces that actually want to break up the United States. I think it's the same forces that wanted to break up Russia. And interestingly enough, I think those forces were mainly centered in the city, in England, in London. And I think we have to look at that actual history and look at our present circumstance, where it looks to certainly almost everybody I'm talking to, like you could not plan a greater way of defeating, and destroying the United States than what's been unfolding in this country through its presidential and other leadership over the last 20, 30 years, right? So what is really going on here is a cultural disintegration and an economic and social and political commercial disintegration. One of the things Orlov points out, he's an engineer, is that the engineering that's going on in Russia, by the way, Russian elected officials tend to come from the engineering class. And if they fail to perform in like their version of state governments, they're removed. They're actually removed and people can perform. There's a functionality that's going on in that culture that's almost unknown here anymore. So I would just say that if we don't start with the vision of a self-critical view of our culture, one, and two, a political plan, whether it's selected or elected, we are not doing anything to. I certainly agree. We're not teaching people civics, but there's something that I think a much more comprehensive vision of what life is for.
Amen.
That has to
William,
become
I've got to thank you, William. I've got to declare we've got 5 minutes during which I will solicit closing thoughts from our main panelists. But I want to just, to you, John Ann, whatever this roundtable is about, if you knew that there's an asteroid speeding on its way here and most people don't know about it, that's how I heard what you were bringing to it. And don't you know, it turned into a catalyst for something that sounds like a solution. Rob wasn't kidding, I don't think, when he said, turn off your cell phones, because if a polar shift just brought us back down to, my God, I got to go meet my neighbors so I have the chance of finding some water and a potato in the next 48 hours, it might be the best thing that ever happened to humanity. Ed, I see your yellow hand. You've got 40 seconds.
My only comment to William was perhaps we've survived in the United States as a society, and this is better than historians would have expected to occur. We started out as 13 independent nation states, managed to somehow come together not very well, and then exploit a giant public domain and carve all these new states out of that public domain with people migrating with very diverse value systems. And somehow here we are in 2024, and we're still together of sorts.
Amen. And therein lies the hope. It's because we cannot be certain about what the future holds. And now for their final thoughts, starting with Rob, and then Paul and Liz, and then Chris Milligan. Rob Morris.
Well, I guess I'll go back to what Chris was saying, where the American education system has been modified to the point where it's become an indoctrination system. And people have got to start to learn to think instead of feel about everything and try to put their rationality forward so they are able to take in new information and weigh that against the information that they've been told from the narratives that have been presented.
Well, that's my invitation to encourage folks to go to TrineDay.com and find books that will blow your mind about books that challenge official history and reveal things behind the curtain to expand your imagination. No, I'm not going to say President Truman's quote. Yes, I am. The only thing new in the world is the history you don't know. So thank you, Rob, for that. Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould.
This has been a wonderful opportunity. Thank you, Bill, for your comments. That's Dmitry Orlov. We followed him for years, and he's got a lot of interesting things to say, and he's gone through the evolution. I mean, we did share something with the Soviet Union, and as you know, there was a lot of cooperation. A lot of the work that we did back in the 1970s and the 1980s was involved with the Soviet Union and trying to get a better, clearer idea as to what exactly was going on with them and how things were, and communicating our ideas to their ideas. And, to see it wind up where it is today is really quite a shame. But aside from that, the fact is that I think there's a lot to be learned from the end of the Soviet Union.
Our host, Chris Milligan.
Again, thank you all for attending. And, going back to a point made earlier, I'm 75, okay? And I did not get a civics class. My older brother got a civics class, okay? So we've got several generations of children, of people who have not got civics class, okay? And this goes back to, what I was talking about the education system. And as was said, we've been very ill served by our education system. And we don't know, we don't know about Robert Morris. We didn't learn about Henry George. Okay. We didn't learn about Smedley Butler. Okay, and that happened in the 30s, and we went to school in the 50s and 60s. That was just a couple of years before. Okay, and it's
And
really,
how about the women and the wives? It's still a patriarchal language.
well,
It's still
absolutely,
and
but at
men that
least
are being
women have the right to vote now. Okay, I mean, women couldn't even have a credit card until the 70s. I mean, it's just amazing. But you know, I'm very hopeful for the future because the internet is allowing all of us to get together, to talk, to, you know, and that's how change happens, is by discussion. Okay, and you wake up in
Bruce?
the morning and you wonder, you know, what are you going to do? How can we, you know, how can our children survive when we see all this perfidy, and how and our education system isn't talking to them about it, you know? But I just feel very, very strongly that with this internet, with the information getting out there, because as I've said before, I used to, you know, have to talk to military people and old spooks, and they wouldn't know what they were doing for 20 years because it was so compartmentalized. Well,
Mhm.
they can't compartmentalize anymore. I'm getting calls from current people in operations, and they're figuring out what's going on. Okay, so and right now we don't have a lottery system, so all we can do is vote. And he's very right in that the election system, okay, and all the propaganda going one way or the other, because you know, one side says, well, this guy's just completely bad, and isn't the America going to heck, you know? And so that's got to have an effect on people when you keep telling them that the world is bad, the president's bad, blah 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 blah. So you know, that is an interesting idea. And thank you again all for spending some time at our round table, and onwards to a better future.